What's up with this tunnel?
It's to move munitions, back when Alcatraz was a military fortress.
Thanks for the history lesson.
After this, I'm putting tour guide on my resume.
Looking back on the Resident Evil franchise as a lifelong fan, across its various evolutions and iterations, it's a weird franchise to say the least, and I'm not entirely sure if I genuinely like half of what's available in the series. I often feel that at this point you really have to keep your expectations fairly measured when it comes to anything new this series offers, as for every Resident Evil 2 remake, there's a subpar 3 remake, and whatever the hell our reverse was meant to be.
No thanks, bro.
This couldn't be any truer when it comes to the various Resident Evil related movies we've had over the years. While I have some soft nostalgia for the first 2 Paul W.S. Anderson adaptations, I can't really say anything positive about the later 4 films. And in fact, I've always had a bit of a theory about why Extinction jumped the shark so drastically with its Mad Max style plot. See, I think that Paul Anderson saw the original 2005 beta trailer for Resident Evil 5, with its sandy apocalyptic visuals, and wildly jumped to the wrong conclusion that the world ended in Resident Evil 5, and not that it was just simply set in Africa.
Once again, you put your keen and penetrating mind to the task and as usual come to the wrong conclusion.
It wasn't until 2008 that we'd finally get an official Resident Evil film from Capcom, in a similar vein to Square Enix's popular and successful film sequel, Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, with Resident Evil Degeneration, and I can remember absolutely loving this film when it came out, mainly because I was 15, I think. This was also when Leon really started to become the series' poster boy, as he also appears in every subsequent CG film. Looking back in retrospect, it's not a bad film exactly, with some quality animation work, and it has some fun fan service moments for fans of Resident Evil 2 by teaming Leon and Claire up again.
Wait! Don't shoot!
Get down! Get down!
But the story is just kind of nonsense, which is something most of these films share in common.
She can tell him I got lost and missed my flight.
Resident Evil Damnation was the next film, released in 2012, a few weeks after Resident Evil 6, and I would say that this is still the best film in the series. The animation is a massive step up from Degeneration, with some fun and ridiculous action sequences, and it says a lot about Leon, voiced perfectly by Matt Mercer, that he's able to carry this film almost entirely by himself. The story is also nice and straightforward, with Leon being deployed into a Slavic civil war because there are BOWs being used, and he tries to stop them. It does get a bit nonsensical when Ada gets involved, but she gets a great fight scene, so I can't complain too much.
This again, huh? It's like I'm stuck in a goddamn loop.
It was with 2017's Resident Evil Vendetta where my reaction to these movies started to become a lot less enthusiastic. I can remember really not liking it at the time, but I decided to give it a rewatch for this video, and it's fine, I guess. The action is really fun when it finally gets into it, with the hallway fight scene being a real standout, and very reminiscent of the Raid. But the story is just utter nonsense. Chris goes to enlist Leon's help because the new virus is related to the Plagas from Resident Evil 4, even though Chris has already fought against the Plagas himself from Resident Evil 5. Okay, so I rewatched this scene while I was editing, and Chris is actually hoping that Leon can provide intel on the Los Illuminados cult, but even that is pretty stupid considering Leon wasn't exactly conversing politely with the locals.
Take whatever measures necessary to save the subject.
Understood. Your right hand comes off?
Die, you worm!
Leon is now a miserable drunk in this movie, just like Chris was in Resident Evil 6. And then returning character Rebecca Chambers is kidnapped by the villain because she looks like his dead wife.
That outfit doesn't suit you.
And then there was 2021's Resident Evil Infinite Darkness, a 2-hour movie that Netflix tried to convince people was a TV series by cutting it up into 4 episodes. I didn't bother rewatching this because I just found it so boring, and I hated how Claire literally did nothing except get kidnapped for Leon to save. The only interesting thing that it did was that it seemingly ended the relationship between Leon and Claire, which I'm not exactly happy about.
Prison tours suck.
Which brings us to the recently released Resident Evil Death Island, with the big hype surrounding this film being that it is the first ever team-up of the original protagonists from Resident Evil 1 and 2, and Rebecca. The Resident Evil Avengers, if you will. I've now watched it twice, the second viewing being back-to-back with Damnation and Vendetta, and while I can confidently say it's infinitely better than Infinite Darkness, it's probably just on par with Vendetta, as there is a lot about this film that kinda doesn't work, and like the video title alludes, the film just feels really half-hearted when it comes to the story and bringing all these characters together. Almost as if the producers were banking on the whole Resident Evil Avengers thing being enough to carry the film. That's not to say that the film isn't enjoyable at all. There's stuff to appreciate on the surface level. The animation is really incredible, there's some fun action scenes, Matt Mercer is back as Leon, which for me was the real highlight, as I'm not a big fan of Nick Apostolidis as the older Leon. Claire actually gets to do some cool things in this movie, that was nice, and Nicole Tompkins is great as Jill Valentine.
No, you think?
But the actual story of Death Island feels like one big afterthought, and honestly, I think quite telling of how Capcom really doesn't know what to do with any of these legacy characters anymore, which is probably why they're remaking every game at the moment.
Got that right.
So Death Island takes place a year after Vendetta, and sees Jill Valentine returning for her first canonical appearance since Resident Evil 5, where she had been brainwashed into an assassin for Albert Wesker, and the film tries to explore her struggles of returning to the BSAA. This is a good idea, as pretty much every fan has been wondering what happened to her after Resident Evil 5, since she hasn't appeared in any sequel. The problem is, this film takes place like 6 years after Resident Evil 5, and in that time there was Revelations 2, Damnation, Resident Evil 6, and Vendetta, the latter two being stories where it would have made more sense to reintroduce Jill into the timeline. The film doesn't even attempt to address what Jill was doing during that time, even though Chris explicitly talks about the events of Resident Evil 6, which just makes it feel more and more like they threw Jill into this movie just to appeal to fans, even though the film really does try to make her the central character. It also doesn't help that Jill looks almost exactly the same as she did in the Resident Evil 3 remake from 2020, which likely saved the animators a lot of work and became quite a talking point of debate amongst fans, even though the official reason from Capcom was that Jill hasn't aged because of the experiments Wesker did on her. An explanation that might have been fine were it not for the fact that Claire also looks exactly the same as she did in Infinite Darkness, which was set in 2006. I mean, this is literally the same character model, aside from a slightly different jacket. Which further just makes me think this movie was half-heartedly thrown together, or that Claire and Jill were super last-minute additions. Because I mean, Leon looks a little different from Vendetta, and Rebecca definitely looks different.
You get used to it.
So basically in this movie, Claire is studying orca whales and finds one infected with a strain of the T-virus, which just so happens to be the same strain that Jill, Chris, and Rebecca are investigating. To which they figure that because the latest victims had all visited Alcatraz Island, something must be going on there. Meanwhile, Leon is nearby trying to apprehend a researcher when he's attacked by Maria Gomez from Vendetta, and he then subsequently tracks them down to Alcatraz as well, in a funny coincidence. There's a couple cool action sequences here that ensue as, predictably, the prison gets overrun with zombies, and the scene down the sewers where Jill and Leon team up is actually a lot of fun. This sequence really made me want to see these two paired up in a game because there is a fun chemistry between Jill's snarky seriousness and Leon's dry bravado that Matt Mercer just pulls off effortlessly.
How many of these are there?
I ain't stopping to count. 0.
What?
You wanted to know how many there were?
But then, unfortunately, the film grinds to an absolute halt, as it decides to devote way too much time to quite possibly the lamest villain in the entire franchise, which is saying something because Resident Evil has a lot of really stupid villains.
Miranda thinks we're nothing but children. Oh, she doesn't care for us? No. She's long lost all her humanity.
Jeez, does he always go on like this?
The motivation for this movie's villain is that he was a mercenary working for Umbrella during the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3, and after his entire team got infected, he had to murder one of his teammates, and now he wants to spread the T-virus through these mosquito drones or something, but not before he had captured and infected Leon, Chris, and Claire to point out that they had all failed in some way in the past, like Chris had gotten people killed, but he leaves Jill uninfected so she can suffer as he did or something, and he's waited nearly 20 years to do this. It's really fucking dumb. And the whole time this guy is waffling on, Jill is just standing there aiming her gun at him, but never takes the shot even though there's nothing really stopping her. I may not have liked a lot of what they did with Leon's characterization in the Resident Evil 4 remake, but one thing I did like was how often he would just shoot first because he was absolutely sick of the villains pontificating needlessly.
To have been bestowed with lore settlers.
You talk too much.
Failed.
Rebecca then shows up with the vaccine miraculously after her team gets eaten by a shark, cures everyone, and then they all team up to fight the huge mutated monster the main villain turns himself into. Oh, and Leon fights Maria before that. And yeah, this is a cool, dumb action spectacle that's suitably over the top and extremely well animated, with fun fan service moments like Jill using a railgun like she did in 3 Remake. The fan in me did enjoy seeing all of these characters team up together for the first time, but it was almost entirely on a surface level, as I didn't really care about the outcome since I was almost 100% certain no one was going to die. The real issue that I think Death Island suffers from is something that I mentioned earlier, in that Capcom really doesn't know what to do with these characters anymore. It's cool to see them all team up together and fight a big monster, that's fun, but there just really isn't any interesting dynamics between all of these characters together, at least not in this movie. There are no struggles between the characters or issues amongst each other to overcome, they just kind of all know each other and work together. When you think back to the first Avengers movie, what made that movie so compelling outside of the action sequences was the dynamics between the characters and how most of them didn't actually get along. Captain America and Iron Man had opposing beliefs, Thor was a stubborn god who was torn over having to fight his brother. There was some interesting interpersonal conflicts all the Avengers had to overcome, which made the final team up all the more satisfying.
That man is playing Galaga. Thought we wouldn't notice, but we did.
Death Island tries to establish a rift with Jill and Chris by making him not want her on the case, but she just brushes him off and that goes nowhere. There was the unresolved ending of Infinite Darkness where Leon and Claire's relationship seemingly ended, but that's not in any way addressed in this film. A scene with them awkwardly trying to get along could have been cool. People like to talk a lot of shit about Resident Evil 6, but they did try some interesting things with the characters in that, like putting Leon and Chris against each other was a cool idea. In fact, looking back, Resident Evil 6 probably should have been the game that finally brought most of these characters together.
Friend of yours?
Resident Evil Death Island certainly isn't the worst film based on the series, but the story just feels so inconsequential and inessential that it just feels like Capcom half-heartedly saying, yeah, all the characters know each other and they teamed up once, isn't that cool? The saddest part I think, however, is that this film is probably the only time we're ever actually going to get to see all these legacy characters together, as I highly doubt that they will ever bring them together in a game, given the characters' ages in the timeline, which just makes the movie feel more disappointing that it's ultimately so forgettable. Anyway, those have been my thoughts on Resident Evil Death Island. It wasn't a bad film exactly, but I'll probably have forgotten about most of it in a few months. And if I ever feel like rewatching one of these CG films again, it'll probably be Damnation. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments if you saw it, and what's your favourite Resident Evil movie? As always, thanks for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you're feeling generous, you can support me on Patreon. Until next time, stay safe out there, remember that prison tours suck, and I'll see you all next time.
Come on. It'll be like we're breaking out of prison. It'll be fun.